Part One, Section 3 of The Maine Woods by Henry David Thoreau. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Part One, Ktaadn, Section 3. The primitive wood is always and everywhere damp and mossy, so that I traveled constantly with the impression that I was in a swamp; and only when it was remarked that this or that tract, judging by the quality of the timber on it, would make a profitable clearing, was I reminded that if the sun were let in it would make a dry field like the few I had seen at once. The best shod, for the most part, traveled with wet feet. If the ground was so wet and spongy at this, the driest part of a dry season, what must it be in the spring? The woods hereabouts abounded in beech and yellow birch, of which last there were some very large specimens; also spruce, cedar, fir, and hemlock. But we saw only the stumps of the white pine here, some of them of great size, these having been already culled out, being the only tree much sought after, even as low down as this. Only a little spruce and hemlock beside had been logged here. The eastern wood, which is sold for fuel in Massachusetts, all comes from below Bangor. It was the pine alone, chiefly the white pine, that had tempted any but the hunter to precede us on this route. Waite's farm, 13 miles from the Point, is an extensive and elevated clearing, from which we got a fine view of the river, rippling and gleaming far beneath us. My companions had formerly had a good view of Ktaadn and the other mountains here, but to day it was so smoky that we could see nothing of them. We could overlook an immense country of uninterrupted forest, stretching away up the East Branch toward Canada on the north and northwest, and toward the Aroostook Valley on the northeast, and imagine what wild life was stirring in its midst. Here was quite a field of corn for this region, whose peculiar dry scent we perceived a third of a mile off, before we saw it. 18 miles from the Point brought us in sight of McCausland's, or Uncle George's, as he was familiarly called by my companions, to whom he was well known, where we intended to break our long fast. His house was in the midst of an extensive clearing, or intervale, at the mouth of the Little Schoodic River, on the opposite or north bank of the Penobscot. So we collected on a point of the shore, that we might be seen, and fired our gun as a signal, which brought out his dogs forthwith, and thereafter their master, who in due time took us across to his batteau. This clearing was bounded abruptly, on all sides but the river, by the naked stems of the forest, as if you were to cut only a few feet square in the midst of 1,000 acres of mowing, and set down a thimble therein. He had a whole heaven and horizon to himself, and the sun seemed to be journeying over his clearing only the livelong day. Here we concluded to spend the night, and wait for the Indians, as there was no stopping place so convenient above. He had seen no Indians pass, and this did not often happen without his knowledge. He thought that his dogs sometimes gave notice of the approach of Indians half an hour before they arrived. McCausland was a Kennebec man, of Scotch descent, who had been a waterman 22 years, and had driven on the lakes and headwaters of the Penobscot 5 or 6 springs in succession, but was now settled here to raise supplies for the lumberers and for himself. He entertained us a day or two with true Scotch hospitality, and would accept no recompense for it. A man of a dry wit and shrewdness, and a general intelligence which I had not looked for in the backwoods. In fact, the deeper you penetrate into the woods, the more intelligent, and, in one sense, less countrified do you find the inhabitants. For always the pioneer has been a traveler, and, to some extent, a man of the world; and as the distances with which he is familiar are greater, so is his information more general and far reaching than the villagers'. If I were to look for a narrow, uninformed, and countrified mind, as opposed to the intelligence and refinement which are thought to emanate from cities, it would be among the rusty inhabitants of an old settled country, on farms all run out and gone to seed with life everlasting, even on the high road in Concord, and not in the backwoods of Maine. Supper was got before our eyes in the ample kitchen, by a fire which would have roasted an ox. Many whole logs, 4 feet long, were consumed to boil our tea kettle, birch, or beech, or maple, the same summer and winter; and the dishes were soon smoking on the table, late the armchair against the wall, from which one of the party was expelled. The arms of the chair formed the frame on which the table rested. and, when the round top was turned up against the wall, it formed the back of the chair, and was no more in the way than the wall itself. This, we noticed, was the prevailing fashion in these log houses, in order to economize in room. There were piping hot wheaten cakes, the flour having been brought up the river in batteaux, no Indian bread, for the upper part of Maine, it will be remembered, is a wheat country, and ham, eggs, and potatoes, and milk and cheese, the produce of the farm, and also shad and salmon, tea sweetened with molasses, and sweet cakes, in contradistinction to the hot cakes not sweetened, the one white, the other yellow till wind up with. Such, we found, was the prevailing fare, ordinary and extraordinary, along this river. Mountain cranberries (Vaccinium vitis idea), stewed and sweetened, were the common dessert. Everything here was in profusion, and the best of its kind. Butter was in such plenty that it was commonly used, before it was salted, to grease boots with. In the night we were entertained by the sound of raindrops on the cedar splints which covered the roof, and awaked the next morning with a drop or two in our eyes. It had set in for a storm, and we made up our minds not to forsake such comfortable quarters with this prospect, but wait for Indians and fair weather. It rained and drizzled and gleamed by turns the livelong day. What we did there, how we killed the time, would perhaps be idle to tell, how many times we buttered our boots, and how often a drowsy one was seen to sidle off to the bedroom. When it held up, I strolled up and down the bank, and gathered the harebell and cedar berries which grew there, or else we tried by turns the long handled axe on the logs before the door. The axe helves here were made to chop standing on the log, a primitive log, of course, and were therefore nearly a foot longer than with us. One while we walked over the farm, and visited his well filled barns with McCauslin. There were one other man and two women only here. He kept horses, cows, oxen, and sheep. I think he said that he was the first to bring a plow and a cow so far, and he might have added the last, with only two exceptions. The potato rot had found him out here, too, the previous year, and got half or two-thirds of his crop, though the seed was of his own raising. Oats, grass, and potatoes were his staples, but he raised also a few carrots and turnips, and a little corn for the hens, for this was all that he dared risk, for fear that it would not ripen. Melons, squashes, sweet corn, beans, tomatoes, and many other vegetables could not be ripened there. The very few settlers along this stream were obviously tempted by the cheapness of the land mainly. When I asked McCauslin why more settlers did not come in, he answered that one reason was, they could not buy the land. It belonged to individuals or companies who were afraid that their wild lands would be settled, and so incorporated into towns, and they be taxed for them; but to settling on the State's land there was no such hindrance. For his own part, he wanted no neighbors. He didn't wish to see any road by his house. Neighbors, even the best, were a trouble and expense, especially on the score of cattle and fences. They might live across the river, perhaps, but not on the same side. The chickens here were protected by the dogs. As McCauslin said, the old one took it up first, and she taught the pup, and now they had got it into their heads that it wouldn't do to have anything of the bird kind on the premises. A hawk hovering over was not allowed to alight, but barked off by the dogs circling underneath, and a pigeon, or a yellowhammer, as they called the pigeon woodpecker, on a dead limb or stump, was instantly expelled. It was the main business of their day, and kept them constantly coming and going. One would rush out of the house on the least alarm given by the other. When it rained hardest, we returned to the house, and took down a tract from the shelf. There was the Wandering Jew, cheap edition, in fine print, the Criminal Calendar, and Parish's Geography, and flash novels, two or three. Under the pressure of circumstances we read a little in these. With such aid, the press is not so feeble an engine, after all. This house, which was a fair specimen of those on this river, was built of huge logs, which peeped out everywhere, and were chinked with clay and moss. It contained 4 or 5 rooms. There were no sawed boards or shingles or clapboards about it, and scarcely any tool but the axe had been used in its construction. The partitions were made of long clapboard like splints of spruce or cedar, turned to a delicate salmon color by the smoke. The roof and sides were covered with the same, instead of shingles and clapboards, and some of a much thicker and larger size were used for the floor. These were all so straight and smooth that they answered the purpose admirably, and a careless observer would not have suspected that they were not sawed and planed. The chimney and hearth were of vast size, and made of stone. The broom was a few twigs of arbor vitæ tied to a stick, and a pole was suspended over the hearth, close to the ceiling, to dry stockings and clothes on. I noticed that the floor was full of small dingy holes, as if made with a gimlet, but which were, in fact, made by the spikes, nearly an inch long, which the lumberers wear in their boots to prevent their slipping on wet logs. Just above McCausland's there is a rocky rapid where logs jam in the spring, and many drivers are there collected, who frequent his house for supplies. These were their tracks which I saw. At sundown McCausland pointed away over the forest, across the river, to signs of fair weather amid the clouds. Some evening redness there. For even there the points of compass held, and there was a quarter of the heavens appropriated to sunrise and another to sunset. The next morning, the weather proving fair enough for our purpose, we prepared to start, and, the Indians having failed us, persuaded McCausland, who was not unwilling to revisit the scenes of his driving, to accompany us in their stead, intending to engage one other boatman on the way. A strip of cotton cloth for a tent, a couple of blankets, which would suffice for the whole party, 15 pounds of hard bread, 10 pounds of clear pork, and a little tea, made up Uncle George's pack. The last three articles were calculated to be provision enough for 6 men for a week, with what we might pick up. A tea kettle, a frying pan, and an axe, to be obtained at the last house, would complete our outfit. We were soon out of McCausland's clearing, and in the evergreen woods again. The obscure trail made by the two settlers above, which even the woodman is sometimes puzzled to discern, ere long crossed a narrow, open strip in the woods overrun with weeds, called the Burnt Land, where a fire had raged formerly, stretching northward 9 or 10 miles to Millinocket Lake. At the end of 3 miles we reached Shad Pond, or Noliseemack, an expansion of the river. Hodge, the assistant state geologist, who passed through this on the 25th of June, 1837, says, "We pushed our boat through an acre or more of buck beans, which had taken root at the bottom, and bloomed above the surface in the greatest profusion and beauty." Thomas Fowler's house is 4 miles from McCausland's, on the shore of the pond, at the mouth of the Millinocket River, and 8 miles from the lake of the same name, on the latter stream. This lake affords a more direct course to Ktaadn, but we preferred to follow the Penobscot and the Pamadumcook lakes. Fowler was just completing a new log hut, and was sawing out a window through the logs nearly 2 feet thick when we arrived. He had begun to paper his house with spruce bark, turned inside out, which had a good effect, and was in keeping with the circumstances. Instead of water, we got here a draught of beer, which, it was allowed, would be better, clear and thin, but strong and stringent as the cedar sap. It was as if we sucked at the very teats of Nature's pine clad bosom in these parts, the sap of all Millinocket botany commingled, the topmost, most fantastic and spiciest sprays of the primitive wood, and whatever invigorating and stringent gum or essence it afforded steeped and dissolved in it, a lumberer's drink, which would acclimatize and naturalize a man at once, which would make him see green, and, if he slept, dream that he heard the wind sough among the pines. Here was a fife, praying to be played on, through which we breathed a few tuneful strains, brought hither to tame wild beasts. As we stood upon the pile of chips by the door, fish hawks were sailing overhead, and here, over Shad Pond, might daily be witnessed the tyranny of the bald eagle over that bird. Tom pointed away over the lake to a bald eagle's nest, which was plainly visible more than a mile off, on a pine, high above the surrounding forest, and was frequented from year to year by the same pair, and held sacred by him. There were these two houses only there, his low hut, and the eagle's airy cartload of fagots. Thomas Fowler, too, was persuaded to join us, for 2 men were necessary to manage the batteau, which was soon to be our carriage, and these men needed to be cool and skillful for the navigation of the Penobscot. Tom's pack was soon made, for he had not far to look for his waterman's boots and a red flannel shirt. This is the favorite color with lumbermen, and red flannel is reputed to possess some mysterious virtues, to be most healthful and convenient in respect to perspiration. In every gang there will be a large proportion of red birds. We took here a poor and leaky batteau, and began to pole up the Millinocket 2 miles to the Elder Fowler's, in order to avoid the Grand Falls of the Penobscot, intending to exchange our batteau there for a better. The Millinocket is a small, shallow, and sandy stream, full of what I took to be lamprey eels, or suckers' nests, and lined with musquash cabins, but free from rapids, according to Fowler, excepting at its outlet from the lake. He was at this time engaged in cutting the native grass, rush grass and meadow clover, as he called it, on the meadows and small, low islands of this stream. We noticed flattened places in the grass on either side, where, he said, a moose had laid down the night before, adding that there were thousands in these meadows. End of Part One, Section 3, recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.